Hi everyone, welcome to AI Idea Crafters. I'm my host E. Today I'm super thrilled to introduce my own professor from Johns Hopkins, who is an expert on AI and games, especially game assessments. Because in the past episodes, many of my audiences, my friends who listen, ask me, let's talk about games, gamification. That's so exciting given what AI can do, not only generate the text, but also like images, videos, as well as all this kind of analysis. Actually, some of my previous guests and my friends have already started experimenting with AI and gamification. So we are all waiting for this episode for quite a while. So I'm like super excited to introduce Dr. James Diamond from Johns Hopkins. So, Dr. Diamond, you have been at the forefront of digital media and education for years. From your early work on values in games to your current work and your role at Johns Hopkins, launching several very exciting AI-related educational programs. Do you mind? And could you give us a quick overview of your career trajectory and the main things driving your research?
Sure. So firstly, thank you for inviting me. I'm super excited to be here with you today, E. And I know we have tons to talk about. And every time you and I do talk, a lot of interesting stuff comes up. So I'm very excited. So a little bit about my career. I have a PhD from NYU in the area of educational communication and technology, and specifically early on in my career, my work was in the area of game-based learning. And even more specifically, I was interested in using games and simulations in history and social studies classrooms. So that's where work earlier in my career was, either in evaluating games or participating in the development of games to support historical thinking. Over the years, and particularly as I've moved into Johns Hopkins, my work has started to move away a little bit from game-based learning and gamification, and now more recently into the use of AI in education. But at the core of my research has always been the very practical aspects of how educators use technologies, right? So as you know, there's many different models for investigating how we learn with technology. Some of those models are kind of one-on-one model between the learner and the technology. Some of those models are in the CECIL or computer-supported collaborative learning space, so how people are learning and collaborating together via technologies. And then some of those models also involve the role of educators. How are educators making use of those technologies, either for the purposes of creating instructional materials or analyzing student work or helping to create learning activities for the classrooms? And most of my work has been and continues to be in this last area, right? So I'm really interested in understanding how educators think about the affordances of technologies, how they understand the affordances of these technologies, and how they make the connections between the affordances of technologies and what they're hoping to do in their own settings. So in a nutshell, that's been my work over the years.
That's fantastic. You know, I remember when I was taking your class about education and technology, the first session we read about this paper, and it talks about how humans shapes technology and technology comes back shape human. That's a very interesting paper. And you mentioned a lot about affordance. I think that captures, one of the cores of this mutually influential, very intertwined relationship between human and technology. Do you mind explain to our audience what do you mean by affordance in this context?
Sure. So affordances is a concept that originally comes out of the area of ecological psychology, right? In work done around understanding how human beings can look at an environment and objects in an environment and make sense of the activities that they can perform or the goals that they can achieve given the features of an environment, right? So an affordance is a perceptual phenomenon. It's how I perceive a certain thing or things in an environment as being able to help me accomplish some set of tasks, right? So an affordance isn't necessarily baked in, meaning it's not built into a technology. It can be, but it's also more about what I perceive the use of the object to be, right? So me perceiving an affordance of a chair for sitting, right? But you could also perceive the affordance of a chair for standing up on it. You could perceive the affordance of a chair for putting against a doorknob to keep a door closed, so on and so forth. So it has to do with the sense that you make of the features of a particular object. And then on the other side of that is this notion of effectivities, right? So affordances allow action, and then effectivities are what are the things that can happen based on the use of those affordances, right? So in really sort of plain terms, to bring it back to the idea of educators and technology, what is this thing that I see in front of me as an educator, right? What am I trying to achieve at any given moment? What are you trying to tell me I should be achieving? And how is this thing going to help me do that? Can I see that? Do I not see it? If I don't see it, do I want to take the time to put into it so that I can understand the affordances? Or do I just not have time because I'm a very busy person and I've got more important things to do? So that's a very sort of, I think, basic way of thinking about affordances in technology.
Thank you so much for the very detailed explanation. Again, I feel like my audience are very lucky to have you because we're gonna have a, Hopkins level doctoral lecture. Yeah. And I really, really like you, like how you bring like affordances and effectivity together. I think that really captures how nowadays generative AI, those concepts can definitely be embedded and exemplified in this AI setting because again, everybody has different perception of what generator can do. And what can make it do in terms of effectivity are also directly different. And a lot of it based on our context, how we perceive our environment and where we perceive the needs, as well as how we perceive the technology. One thing so interesting is everybody's perception, again, it's like very subjective. But as a whole, when we interact with the environment, such as the media going to talk about it, like the audience going to listen to this podcast, there are some elements of like intersubjectivity also involved because the environment can change our perception, our subjectivity as well. So again, I think it is how, technology and humans are kind of like influencing one another in a very spiral type of manner. And that brings up like one big question as was a quote unquote concern that I have heard many people, not just teachers, parents, product managers, they all talk about, which is learner agency. Because generator can be so powerful. Ask a question, gonna give me a super long detailed answer. Sometimes as a student, I feel like, oh, I already know, quote unquote, know, or I have complete my learning tasks, which, they didn't realize it's actually AI was doing the work, not you. So, the people who are more critical about AI use in classroom talks a lot about learner agency. And in your previous research, in your current research, you've spoken a lot about combining design-based research with learner agency. Why do you think it's so critical for students and educators to feel a sense of agency in today's digital learning landscape?
So I think that agency is at the heart of motivation, which is at the heart of learning, right? That in order, as educators, we want our learners to grow and to develop. And individual agency and autonomy are at the heart of growth and development, right? Me being able to explore those things that interest me, those things that excite me, those things about which I am curious, those things toward which I feel a need to understand, right? Those all rely on agency. I need to be able to take some action in order to explore, in order to come to understand. And so if we're not providing our learners with agency, we run the risk of stymieing motivation. And indeed, I think we run the risk of stymieing growth and development. So in the context of design-based research, for example, which is highly context dependent, right? Design-based research is all about being formative, so developing iteratively and doing so in very specific contexts, right? Very specific places with very specific people who are trying to achieve certain goals. And part of that context has to involve agency. What are our learners, but also indeed, what are our educators trying to do? What are they wanting to do here? And how can we as designers, developers, researchers of these technologies support their motivation? How do we support their curiosity? How do we support their exploration? And so when we develop our technologies, when we study them, when we design them iteratively, we need to keep coming back to this question of, in what ways is this supporting agency? Now, the other important piece, as you know, is that it's not just about the technology, especially in formal educational settings, it's about the pedagogy, right? So how is the surrounding set of instructional approaches and strategies, how is that also supporting learner agency, right? There are ways in which tech can support agency, there are ways in which it can thwart it. Same thing with pedagogy, right? If we are creating instructional settings that are really not intended to open up avenues of exploration for students and to allow them to investigate their own wonderings, then we are running the risk of shutting down agency. And so I think agency really needs to be at the heart of design-based research, considerations of agency.
Yes, I totally agree. And I really like how you bring up the notion of iteration through design-based research. I think that's a very important lesson for everyone, not just teachers, students, but also for edtech product designers and entrepreneurs. Because like we have a product specialist, people are exploring how we can integrate generative AI into the edtech products we can, deploy to the students, teachers, and parents and schools. It's not a one-step thing. Like you have to, like you said, take into pedagogy and also assessments, which we want to cover soon. And take it as a continuous process. Like things are never gonna be perfect at the very first, but how can we continue the momentum to iteration is super important. So I also have a question regarding from games to generative AI, which are your expertise. So in your view, what is the biggest shift or opportunity that generative AI is bringing to the educational technology field, especially designing for more meaningful game-based learning experiences?
I really appreciate this question. My response is going to be very speculative at this point because I haven't done a lot of work in this space yet. And I don't know that we're seeing a lot of work done just yet. I think we're going to be moving in that direction. So how about I answer this maybe by telling you a little bit sort of about one of my fantasies for this space?
Oh, yeah, of course.
So I've long been interested in the idea of using educational games, and not just me, many others in this space, of using educational games for formative assessment, right? So formative assessment being ongoing assessment, giving our learners opportunities to practice, demonstrate, and build what they know, and then enabling educators to take away from those experiences to gain some insight into student progress, right? Now, formative assessment, we know, is extremely important. It can be, doesn't have to be, but it can be quite labor intensive, right? If we're constantly in the practice of assessing, that means we constantly have to be in the process of building sort of problems or interventions, however small, in order to do that assessment. And that can be quite labor intensive and resource intensive. Now, the interesting thing is when you layer on games, as you know, for some learners, they're more motivating, right? Games can be quite motivating. And so if we can take those motivational aspects of games and use them as formative spaces, then in theory, that's a win-win, right? We have this motivating activity and we're able to gather data to make some sense of how our learners are progressing. Now, bearing in mind the resource intensiveness, Now we introduce generative AI, right? Which in theory should be able to make sense of various sources of data and learn from the data in order to generate almost on the fly this formative assessment, right? So I said, you have to keep repeating it, you have to keep creating it, and that takes time. But the generative AI may be able to do that almost instantaneously and not involve the amount of labor that's involved with teachers. Now, I'm not trying to cut teachers out, but I'm trying to say that what if we could use the generative AI to create this formative assessment on the fly such that teachers can spend more time making sense of the data? So imagine something like a persistent game world, a persistent online game world, right? One that's just running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Only it's hooked up with generative AI. And now I'm bracketing a lot about privacy concerns, right? And these are things we can talk about, but let's pretend for a second that these concerns don't exist. So there's persistent online game world that's hooked up with generative AI, and it's got access to this data about what students / players have been doing in the game space, and it's able to generate these problems, right, that are aligned to learning objectives, right? So it's able to generate these problems that are asking learners to put into practice the skills that we've connected to our learning objectives. Well, that to me is a fascinating space, right? Not only in terms of, I think, what could allow for more robust ongoing formative assessment, I think it potentially opens up avenues for richer and deeper forms of authentic assessment, right? So authentic assessment activities that are more closely aligned to the real world activities in which we're hoping that our learners will eventually go and practice and continue to grow with their skills, as opposed to the kinds of assessments that we sometimes see in schools, right? Things like tests and so on, and there's a place for those. But I think that something like game-based learning or simulation-based learning that is supported by generative AI, that is responsive and able to personalize based on student data, is potentially a very, very exciting set of explorations in the near future.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your visions. And I really, really appreciate like before you giving us this visionary description, you mentioned like quote unquote speculative, which is totally fine because I personally feel like, you know, we are still exploring the boundaries of what generator can do.
Yeah.
Of course, we need to be very imaginative to the point that because like we have a vision, and we know what it can do that then we can come reversely like we can start from the results and think about how we can use design-based research, how we do iterations. And of course this journey is not gonna be smooth. We have to like test here, get some feedback, and test there, get some feedback.
Right.
But having that vision is super super important because that's where it's guiding us. And that's why I love to have research like you on the podcast because from my education from Hopkins, I come in as a software engineer. I know not much about, educational field, especially pedagogy. And then when I started to learn pedagogy and I was like, well, this is so fascinating because, you know, I remember in our very first class, we were talking about, okay, exactly what is education? We started from the four perspectives, economics, sociology, history, blah, blah, blah. But essentially, one of my biggest takeaway is what make a theory is the theory can not only helps you to explain, but also help you to make inference and give you guidance on how you can evaluate on those inference. And that makes, educational or theoretical training so important because the inference part of it and the evaluation part of it is something it's so lacking in real world when it comes to product development or just like new pedagogical technique implementation because we don't know what to evaluate. Yeah, so now I think it's time for me to ask about gaming and assessments in the age of generative AI from your perspective. Um, so Previously, as you mentioned, you started with this game in social study classroom to foster historical thinking in the very beginning. And you have this playing with data project that showed how teachers can use real-time gameplay data to guide instruction. It's almost like a quote unquote assistant to the teachers, if my understanding is correct. And now, fast forward in the age of generative AI, how do you see generative AI enhancing this kind of teacher-facing dashboard or formative assessment tools in this particular context?
So, so for a little bit of context, playing with data was a National Science Foundation funded project going back about 10 years ago that started life as a game for tablets that had been developed by ETS, the Educational Testing Service, to help middle school students develop basic skills in argumentation, right? So ETS, in collaboration with some other organizations, created a science fiction based game. The conceit was that students were studying in a school on the planet Mars, in this early human colony on Mars, and the way that decisions were being made in the colony was via argumentation. And so students had to learn how to argue, right? So the game was developed, and then we began pilot testing it in classrooms. And one of the things about games, and this continues to be the case, is that they are not traditional instructional activities in some ways, right? And this sort of gets us at some of the distinctions between game-based learning and gamification. So teachers have been gamifying activities in the classroom for a long time, right? Students achieve a certain number of things, they get gold stars and so on. But game-based learning involves learning inside of a game, right? So we're not adding game elements to activities that aren't a game. It's actually a game. And in theory, as students are playing and progressing, they are actually learning, right? And they're putting skills into practice. Well, one challenge for teachers is, what should I be looking at? What should I be looking for? And this isn't specific to games, right? This is true for any of us as educators, right? That when we have learning progressions and learning objectives in mind, we have to know what those look like, right? We have to know what a sort of low to medium to high skilled learner looks like in some specific area, right? What are the behaviors? What should I be looking for as an indicator that my student is either well along the way toward progressing toward this objective or has some work to do, and here's how I might think about doing that? Well, looking at a game is not necessarily the first way, or looking at gameplay is not necessarily the first way that an educator might do that, right? Unless they've got practice using games and simulations. So as part of that project, we realized that, right? That not only that, but teachers can't run around a classroom full of 30 students observing 30 students play a game at one time, right? So we have this idea of a data dashboard, not specific to games. We see them all over the place. But this dashboard was aggregating gameplay for individual students and then across the classroom, and trying to help teachers make some inferences about what the gameplay meant with respect to learning progressions, right? So it was based on this evidence-centered design, or ECD, assessment development model, and again, which calls for a very close link between activity and learning objectives, right? And how do those link up? So we created these dashboards. We got them in teachers' hands. And one of the things that we were interested in, well, we're interested in two main things, really, was one, at the exploratory level, it's just what sense were teachers making of this data? So that was one thing. But we're also interested in this particular project at determining whether this dashboard could become a form of what's sometimes called educative curriculum materials, right? So when we think of curriculum traditionally, it's geared toward helping students learn, right? But curriculum can also be developed in such a way that it also helps educators learn, right? So the curriculum developers can be in conversation with teachers in a way via the curriculum materials to actually help teachers improve their practice. And we were interested in using this dashboard as a way to help teachers become better data-driven decision makers or data-informed decision makers, right? How could they make sense of this data, make some inferences about student learning, and then further make some decisions about what changes they might need to make to instruction based on their interpretation of the data, okay? So that project moved as far as it could at that time. We did do a randomized controlled trial. We found some relatively small positive effects in terms of the ability for this educative dashboard, as we came to call it, to actually help teachers improve certain data-informed decision-making skills. But now bring this up to today with generative AI, right? So, and again, let's even sort of set aside the possibility for the generative AI to do things like generate gaming scenarios on the fly, right? So at that time, it was a pretty well-scripted game scenario, right? But now with the use of AI, you can just have the AI continuing to script scenarios. But take the AI on the coaching side here, as it were, right? So let's begin to think of the generative AI as a coach. It might be sitting alongside the dashboard with the teacher, right? Making some sense of the data, right? Pulling from different data sources about students, again, bracketing the many, many concerns about privacy and security, and making its own recommendations to teachers. What is the AI seeing in this data with respect to learning objectives, right? It's going to be left to the teacher to agree or disagree, but the AI hopefully can also give the teacher some insight into why it's interpreting the data that way, right? It also has a sense of the learning objectives. It knows something about these learners. It's able to look at the activities in which they've been engaging in the game space and may be able to make some sense of how those gameplay activities relate to learning outcomes, which then get served up repeatedly to teachers in a report, for example, or multiple reports, right, about individual learners or groups of learners and where they're heading and what changes might need to get made to instruction in order to help keep them progressing toward their learning objectives. So that to me is a very, it's very clear and I think very viable role for generative AI around data dashboards in game-based learning.
That is fantastic, and thank you so much for guiding us or walking us through this design-based research as a real example. And I really like when you mentioned like learning inside the game and using AI to make sense of the data. So in this way, with AI-driven analytics, we can help the teachers remain the driver's seat while also learning, while also letting the students enjoy the more autonomy in their learning experiences. I do have one more follow-up questions regarding games and game-based assessments. I have seen these two main string like on the which are opposite of each other at least the surface level about like using game or like AI-based game in learning. Like one supporter group was like, oh yeah, with AI we have multimodal tools, not only like text, but also images, voices, and more. And we can combine these multimodal capabilities in the game, and especially to promote higher order thinking and creativity. On the other hand, which are the opponents, were like, which is actually a widespread concern. It's like games might be distracting in classroom, and especially distract from serious learning. And you previously mentioned this thing of authenticity, which I think is a very interesting notion in this regard. So I wonder, like, what are your views on these two similar like opposing ideas of having games and AI in the classroom? Like, one thinking about a more productivity and creative higher order thinking, one thinking about, people no longer are interested in actual learning, but just playing the game for fun.
So this is an old debate, right? Particularly in the educational technology field. Learning is loaded with cultural context, right? Everybody has a different idea of what learning looks like or what it should look like, right? So this is very true. Going back to the beginning of my career in using games in the classroom and walking into New York City public school classrooms and piloting the use of some educational games with teachers, and administrators and sometimes parents walking into the classroom and wondering, well, what's going on? Why are my kids, why are my youth, why are my students using games in the classroom? That's not the point of a classroom, right? They might play games outside of school, but why are they doing that here, right? And that stands to reason. Again, there is a kind of line of thought on education, which is that education is serious business, right? And then you have kind of this frame of, well, what does serious business look like, right? Is it students seated at individual tables in a row facing the front of the classroom, listening to the teacher talk and studiously capturing notes? Or is it serious business with students each oriented toward their own tablet or laptop, engaged in a personalized learning experience, and again, studiously taking notes and engaging in activities, but probably not playing games, right? Because games have this sense of frivolity. The games are silly, right? Games are not serious, except it turns out, particularly when you're coming through the game-based learning lens, but also we have many, many decades of research to know that lots of learning occurs in games. Lots of learning occurs in playful experiences, right? So the technology and the use of the technology is a function of the broader context. So how is the school approaching learning? How is the community approaching learning? What is the framework? Is it this serious business in which there's no play? Or is it a business in which we can have many different kinds of activities that, so long as they are intentionally designed and thoughtfully applied to support growth and development, that it's okay to have play, right? Now, I very much fall inside of that camp, which isn't to say that games can't be distracting. Of course they can. Any learning activity can be distracting depending on the learners, depending on the context, right? So of course they can be a problem, but that's true for, I think, any learning activity, right? It depends on the implementation. It depends on the design of the activity. It depends on how it's implemented. It depends on the surrounding pedagogy, right? If I can come away and I can provide you with some evidence that, yes, you walked into a classroom and you watched my students playing a game for 30 minutes over some amount of time. But if I can come away with evidence and say, well, look at that, it turns out that while they were playing this game, they were actually building this skill and they were putting it into practice and they were reflecting on it in this way. And then maybe even further, they were connecting that skill to situations outside of the game, right? We don't just have them using games because we just want them using games. And the idea is that what they're doing inside of formal settings, we want them taking outside of formal settings. And so if I can provide you with evidence to say that, well, yes, even though this is a game, even though this looks like something that might be silly or fun, it turns out that this is connecting to other experiences and activities that you think are important outside of the classroom. Then I think we should have a discussion about the value of using games in the classrooms. And I think there's a strong argument to be made for it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, totally. I think that brings up to, the next session, which I want to learn more about this design-based research approach, which I believe will be super interesting and helpful for our listeners. Because in the podcast, I'm always trying to bring the research and educational theoretical aspect into the everyday practice. And people tell me they find it is so helpful and constructive. And, especially I think through this kind of dialogues, what is really so interesting and helpful here is, we'll talk about theory, but contextualize them in narratives, we're actually talking about how we can operationalize those constructs in everyday life. And this notion of operationalization is something I want to dive more in terms of design-based research. So in the beginning, you talk briefly about what design-based research is. And I'm more curious about in terms of like designing the games, because I remember in our class, 2 years back, you also mentioned like this co-developing solutions with teachers and students. So I think this question is what I want to ask on behalf of the audience is, in your opinion, how does DBR, design-based research, differ from traditional R&D methods in education? And since we talk about it's a very iterative co-design, and what are your thoughts of how can we operationalize what we want to study into the iterative design process involving both pedagogy and potentially games? We don't have to talk about games. That, if I were a teacher or if I were a product manager, I want to develop something. How do I learn, okay, which aspect of the things I'm developing or classes I'm teaching, I can operationalize that using a DBR approach and make it really effective?
So there's a couple questions in here. So let's, and you're going to have to remind me of some of them. But let me start the first one that comes back to mind anyway, which is how am I distinguishing design-based research from what might be considered more traditional educational research methods? So one way of thinking about traditional educational research methods at this point is the idea that some set of experts or some set of researchers or developers somewhere in the world perceive some kind of an educational problem, right? Something in the numeracy space, maybe. Primary school students aren't doing A, B, and C under the broad umbrella of numeracy, and they think they've come up with an intervention to put into practice. And so they do that. They create these materials. It may or may not be technology-based. It may be a pedagogy. And then they go into classrooms. And in the traditional sense, ideally what you wanted to do was randomize and control, right? So you wanted to have experimental conditions in which you could say, well, some set of students has my intervention and some set of students doesn't, and I want to compare them, right? And then I want to try to control for as many variables as possible. So basically, I want to be able to say, well, the students in group A and students in group B, all things being equal, are more or less the same, right? The only difference here being is that A has my intervention and B doesn't. And then you want to take some measurements and see if there are any differences. Well, for a long time, and particularly in the educational technology space, we weren't finding real meaningful differences, right? And I'll give you a little bit of a spoiler. This is still true today, right? It's very, very difficult to find these kinds of very large effect sizes in terms of educational technology research, and we can talk more about that later. But one of the responses to the why aren't we finding any differences is the realization that learning is complicated and messy, and human beings are complicated and messy when it comes to learning, not only individually inside of our own minds and bodies, but as minds and bodies inside of socially situated and connected spaces, right? It's complicated. And so the idea of design-based research is just that we need to be extremely attuned to the very specific circumstances and people in which our interventions are being used. And by becoming attuned to those differences, we become better at sharpening or improving the intervention, right? To go back to the idea of affordances, maybe better at sharpening or improving the features of the technology or the intervention based on the specific circumstances of the learners, the classroom, the educator, whatever the context, right? So that's one way of thinking about design-based research, is that it's very, very attuned to specific circumstances. But then the other piece is, as you've mentioned, is this iterative piece, right? And the notion of continuous improvement, right? That we don't do one and done, right? That in design-based research, we are more often than not thinking formatively and developmentally, right? That we know improvements can always be made. And so the methods that we take here really have to do with kind of rapid iteration, right? We begin not with a perfect intervention. We actually begin with a paper mock-up, right? We begin with, as soon as we start having these concepts and we have some ideas of why they think they're going to work, we put them down in a very basic and elementary way, and we start piloting them, and we see what happens, right? Do we see learners using them this way? Do we see educators using them this way? What kinds of feedback are we getting from educators? Is this useful? Is this supporting them in terms of moving toward the objectives that we say it's moving? It should be helping move them toward, or have we missed the mark as developers? Maybe educators are coming back to us and saying, well, you're kind of in the right space, but actually it's this set of challenges that my students are having, right? And then maybe we see that play out with the learners and we can collect the same kind of feedback from the learners. Well, then we want to go back and we want to make some revisions, right? And we want to try again, and we want to try again, and we want to try again. So this is the notion of design-based research, right? That we keep doing it iteratively in very specific contexts, right? It's very, very sensitive to the individual context.
Cool. Thank you so much for the explanation. I really like the concept. The way I understand it is previously when we think about research, of course, we have to focus on who that particular population is. But with design-based research, it's not just that who, but also the who under where, when, and how. So it's totally conceptualized. I like the word used, like attuned in this case. And in terms of research, we talk about the validity of the research results, which I think DBR definitely serves that. How do you think about the generality of DBR in terms of, because now I focus on the when, where, how of that particular population, like maybe certain, in this class, like for example, in our doctoral POP, right? Well, problem practice, we always focus on in this particular class, in this particular concept, we have this problem, and how do you think about like scaling up a particular DBR solution?
So this is one of the longstanding critiques of DBR, as you know, right? Is that there can be a scalability challenge because we're so attuned to context, because we are so circumstance bound, as it were, that we haven't necessarily been able to scale those individual solutions to bigger spaces, right? Going from an individual classroom to a school to a district, so on and so forth. And one potential solution that's been explored is DBIR, right? So design-based implementation research, which is trying to take DBR methods, but then also fold in the idea that we do want to scale to other settings. And so we need to understand how we can start to break past the individual context, right? So what are other places that might be sharing similar educational problems to this one that we're investigating here? Why? And then what can we put into place such that this intervention or solution that we are proposing can be used in other areas, right? So this is the notion of DBIR, is that, yes, we can use design-based research methods, but we also have to layer in at the same time the investigation into how this solution is going to be used in multiple settings and by multiple people. And that means bringing many different stakeholders into the process, right? And giving those stakeholders the opportunity to provide feedback, right? It could be early on, many stakeholders say, you know what, this just isn't a problem for us, or this is not a challenge for us, in which case it's not something then that you would really worry about scaling, right? But it could be that you bring in stakeholders, particularly if you have some sense from the beginning of what this problem is and whether and in what ways it's widespread, that you are bringing in the right stakeholders and that they can see sort of the broad outlines of the problem. Like, oh, right, I see these numeracy issues here. We have something similar here, but that's not going to work in our classrooms because A, B, and C, right? Well, then that starts to give you an opportunity to wonder about, okay, well, how can we get it to work in classrooms A, B, and C if we think the foundational aspects are efficacious, right? If there is something here to our solution. But this is time consuming. It is labor intensive. It is resource intensive for sure, right? And so going back a good 10, 15 years, there was lots of talk about research practice partnerships, right, as one way to get these kinds of DBIR projects going and to keep them going is to sort of create these formal partnerships among researchers and practitioners in different settings and have them in dialogue and discussion and co-creating with one another over time as a way to help implement, to help scale these kinds of DBR studies. But again, it remains quite challenging.
Yeah, thank you for the explanation. That really, really helps a lot. And since you mentioned the challenges, that actually brings my next question is with generative AI evolving so quickly, what, in your opinion, how do you incorporate rapid changes in technologies like generative AI into DBR or DBIR cycle? Have you found new strategies to keep project like very agile or teacher-centered or student-centered? And I also previously asked about this operationalization. And I wonder if you don't mind also providing some guidance to our audience, like how can we operationalize, like if I were a PM, I want to focus on incorporating games to teach mathematics. Like how can I operationalize what I want to measure? And if possible, can I both adopt AR and DBR, DBIR in the process? It would be great if you can walk through us briefly through the process. I know it's a long process, but it would be nice to hear your guidance.
Sure. So when we talk about operationalizing, we talk about, in my view, making something observable that is otherwise abstract is an idea, right? So to go back to the example of the historical thinking skill that I was talking about way back, right? Historical thinking is an idea, right? It's a way of talking about the cognitive processes that historians put into practice when they are creating accounts of the past, right? And it turns out when you break that down, there's actually all kinds of cognitive processes that are going on, right? So operationalization means taking those processes and making them observable and indeed measurable from my perspective, right? So this is the idea of operationalization is what does a learning objective look like, right? How will I know historical thinking when I see it? Or in my very specific case at one point, how will I know historical empathy? How will I know that my learner is gaining some insight into how a particular person in a time and place in history might have thought about some situation or problem? How will I know that? What does that look like, right? Well, that's the process of operationalization, right? And a lot of that work gets done when we talk about learning progressions, right? So we have an idea of what mastery looks like in any given for any given competence or competencies, and then we work backwards from there, right? What does mastery look like? What does semi-mastery look like? So on and so forth. And so we have something to observe then, right? We have some set of behaviors to observe. Well, then the case becomes when we layer in educational technology, right? how is the technology, again, how are the affordances of the technology supporting that operationalization, right? So in the context of games, we talk about mechanics, right? We talk about play mechanics and learning mechanics, right? Mechanics are the things you can do in games. Well, again, that's operationalization, right? When you can do something in a game that is aligned to this concept that has been operationalized, then you gain some insight into whether the player is moving toward your targeted learning objectives. So operationalization is work that can and should be done at the top of a project, right? This is in some ways backward design, right? You start with the learning that you're trying to achieve. You as an educator, you as a designer or developer need to have a very clear understanding, image, and vision of what the learning looks like. How will you know when your learners have learned? How will you know when they are demonstrating competency at some moment in time? And then you work backwards from there, right? What does that look like at each step of the way? And then what do I need to design? What do I need to put in place to support that ongoing operationalization, right? Such that they can operationalize those skills. So operationalization needs to start right from the beginning, and you design backwards from there. And in the context of design-based research, that is our beginning, right? What's the problem here? Mm. What is the learning problem? What is the educational challenge here? How do we articulate it? Number one, do you and I see the same problem? Do we see the same challenge? Are we in agreement? Do we see something different? And if so, why? And if we do, can we compromise? What do we have to do, right? But we have to start from the operationalization, knowing what the problem is, and then starting to think very quickly about, okay, what are the solutions that we want to try here, given what we're seeing with individual learners or groups of learners or classrooms and educators. And then we keep checking. We keep coming back to this question, like, how is what they're doing relating to what's been operationalized, right? What's the relationship between what we're seeing here and the intended learning outcomes? Is something getting in the way? Are they stuck somewhere? Are they not getting the proper amount of support somewhere, right? And then we go back and we try to introduce these other layers if needed. Now, you mentioned generative AI. Again, this is a place where I can imagine, if AI has been trained properly, that it is helping us do this iteration rapidly, right? We think this is, we need a lot of research here, right? Because this is true for anything that the AI is going to generate. It's only as good as the data on which it are being trained, right? And we need to check it constantly, just as it's true we need to check what any given human researcher or developer is producing constantly, right? There need to be quality assurance mechanisms. But I do think that the generative AI, provided it's being trained adequately, should be able to help us do this kind of iteration rapidly in a DBR context, including operationalizing and reoperationalizing as we're going, right? Am I answering your question?
Yes, totally. And I really, really appreciate like your detailed walkthrough of how we can operationalize and the concept and examples you gave. And I think that explains itself, like how as I was listening, I can visualize a lot of very detailed cases in which you can use generative AI to make sense of the data so the teachers can understand what's going on in a fast and more efficient manner. You can use generative AI to, for example, come up with different use cases in which teachers can easily adopt, provided those cases are aligned with the learning objectives. And again, I think using generative as a way to provide more affordances, as a providing more effectivity, and now teachers really have to think so hard, like, because you already have a lot of information, so which one you're gonna pick, right? And now we have talked a lot about research, especially you really gave us a detailed picture and a walkthrough how we can implement those, I want to talk about your recent work on social entrepreneurship and edtech, which is so exciting. And I found this on the Hopkins website. You are now leading this or launching this course called Future Learn, and social entrepreneurship in educational technology, which is the new MOOC courses. And you focus on ideation and market research for mission-driven edtech ventures. Out of curiosity, like what prompted you to frame educators, social entrepreneurs, rather than just consumers of edtech?
So thank you for this question. So this is an old area of interest for me. There's a lot of money in ed tech, as you know, a lot. And there has been for a long time. And there is constantly a great deal of pressure on education systems, not just primary and secondary, but higher education systems as well. There is constantly pressure to integrate technology. The pressures aren't always clear, right? Again, some of this has to do with what is our understanding of what learning is, right? So some of those pressures, we're seeing this right now, that you have got to start integrating the use of generative AI into the classroom because that's what everybody's going to be using. And it is your job as an educator to get them using those tools right now. Well, there's a lot of assumptions baked into that, a lot, right? We don't actually know if this is what everybody's going to be using because we're living in the here and now, right? So that's one issue. The also issue of exactly what is the role of an education? What is the role of a higher education with respect to skills development, with respect to the ability to become a reflective human being, with respect to the ability to become a critical thinker and creative problem solver, and where and how does the use of these technologies fold into those goals, right? As to much more specific, as opposed to much more specific sort of concrete training skills. But there are these pressures. And there's a lot of money to be made, and that's a fine thing in and of itself. People come to the development of tools with the intention of making a profit. And sometimes with the intention of improving people's lives, right? My idea with social entrepreneurship in ed tech is that, entrepreneurialism is one frame, right? To which we might have our learners come to ideating, thinking, promoting, implementing educational technologies. Another slightly different frame is this mission-driven approach, right? Is the idea that, well, yes, there may be profit to be made, but there's also at a bottom line, the mission, right? How are we helping our learners develop, right? How are we helping our learners grow? Not everybody's always starting with that question, right? Or those questions. And when you start with those questions, as you know, there are different paths you can take. You could take design-based research paths, right? You could try to learn deeply about individual learners and the contexts in which they are operating before you start designing tools, right? And before you start with a campaign to get those tools out into widespread usage. So my interest in social entrepreneurship and educational technology is really an interest in trying to prepare at least some small group of people to begin with a very human-centered, value-sensitive, mission-driven approach to the development of these technologies. Again, that does not preclude profit-making, right? And maybe in the best of all worlds, there's profit-making and there is furthering the mission, right? To improve growth and development, but starting with growth and development at the core, right? And having a set of practices, processes, heuristics, values in place as an entrepreneur to help you bake those into, as it were, the development of the product. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And I really appreciate you bring up this value-based, like mission-driven design. And I wonder if you can give some examples of mission-driven, how we can incorporate values and missions into ed adventures from your course.
So I think that, for example, right now, there are, I mean, as you know, the field is flooding with generative AI supported tools, right? Some of them to support in the development of materials for teachers, some of them to create student instructional activities. But one sort of subset, one area that I'm really interested in right now is the use of generative AI for simulation and role play building, right? And to come at this from the perspective of mission driven, to me, means beginning from the idea that there's plenty of evidence that we have at our disposal to know how to scaffold learning in certain settings, right? And when we're mission driven, then we begin from that, right? And so let's think about something like prompt engineering. I mean, this is something I'm doing a lot of playing with right now in trying to develop role-playing simulations using generative AI chatbots, right? That you can, as you know, you could create a very, very, very simple prompt. Tell the AI, you are a climate scientist who is talking with a bunch of skeptical, people who are skeptical about climate change. Help change their minds or something like that, right? Very, very basic prompt. Now, any model will do something with that. It's fine, right? But the question is, how effective is that as an educational experience, right? If there's just this sort of back and forth in the role play. Depends on the learner is the answer. But we know that scaffolding it might be helpful, and specifically scaffolding it for reflection, right? Scaffolding it for self-regulation, scaffolding the learner such that they are asking themselves questions as this is going on, right? Like, what am I doing here? What are the questions I'm asking? What did this simulation just say to me? And how does this relate to climate change? So on and so forth, right? Well, we need to be conscious of that in our prompt building, right? The AI is not going, in all likelihood, is not going to do that kind of scaffolding on its own. And so again, to come back to this idea of being mission driven, I would say that that is at the core of your mission then, right? That is at the core of my mission is I want to set out to develop educational technologies that are going to help learners be reflective, right? Because that correlates with many, many positive outcomes that I hope to see. Well, then from the beginning, that influences the design, right? That influences how I'm collecting data about what I'm seeing. That influences changes that get made iteratively to the prompt, for example. That influences the pedagogy that surrounds it, right? So that's what I mean by being mission driven, in the sense is that I'm just sort of very solidly grounded in these learning principles, and that is a primary commitment, right? It's not, in my view, my commitment to learning principles isn't as a way to get me to profit. It could be, right? But I'm saying that in and of itself, that is a primary goal, right? It's learning. Profit may be related. Whereas I think in a less mission-driven orientation, a dedication to the learning principles is as a way to get you toward profit. Now, I'm not trying to be, I don't mean that in any sense as a kind of purist sense, right? But I do think it is a useful way as a developer, as an entrepreneur, as somebody who's engaged in the enterprise of bringing people together and bringing resources together to make something happen. It's useful to keep those principles in mind, right? What am I doing here and why? Because I need to keep coming back to that when I need to make changes.
Yeah, thank you so much. It just reminded me a lot of things I have done, and then when I was in college, I took this course from the School of Social Policy in my university about social entrepreneurship. And it was then I actually funded a refashioning company that really trying to incorporate this sense of social entrepreneurship. And I was like, in this refashioning company, we are getting the unwanted uh, used clothes, either personal use clothes or unwanted excessive textile from those fashion brands. And then we work with, student designers, we work with people with some disabilities, but still very good, crafters, and we turn them into bags. And of course, it's not very profit driven because I was still trying to figure out the product market fit, like where the people actually want it. But I think the whole thing was driven by my purpose, my mission, my vision, that I believe everybody in the value or supply chain, quote unquote, value chain can give and also get. It's not, just nonprofits give you money, donate money, and that's it. But really treat everybody as equal. So we essentially exchange, what we can offer. And, like my personal interpretation from what is a mission, what is a value, and also just after listening to what you have described earlier was, the sense of purpose is very essential. And this purpose is not individual focused. It's not just at my or me level. It has to go beyond me or our team. It has to be bigger than us. And in order to align that, like as you mentioned about pedagogy, um, techniques. And that reminds me, okay, we need to be really authentic. Exactly what it is. Like we focus on authentic outcome, exactly what the tool, whether or not we integrate it with generative AI, can actually bring to students. And definitely not beautify it, not glorify it. It is what it is. And because we face the authenticity, then we can come back adopting various methods, definitely using the design-based approach, given this context. Um, Focused on authenticity, we can then figure out what is actually real and what is actually working or not working. And I think that's a very powerful mission statement for social entrepreneurship and attack. And one you also mentioned a very interesting example, like this simulation and role playing. I was actually exploring something similar with a friend of mine who's actually also our audience, but I getting connected with her, and she is doing this super super um, fascinating PBL course on climate change and media literacy. And we were trying to figure out how we can adopt generative AI as a part of the pedagogy. And, in the beginning, I was like, let's not use it just because of its AI. But then we figured out because the way she designed the course was so interesting that she will intentionally putting quote unquote like fake scientists or fake authorities and then equip it with publications that sounds very, very reasonable. And in her class before AI, she has to present this as a person, like in person, and having the students read it, and she have to scaffold and guide them through as a human teacher. But we're like, okay, maybe we can use generative AI. So instead of having a chatbot, you talk with them. Now the chatbot is actually, the role of this quote unquote fake scientist or fake authority. And this person is trying to persuade you as a student. So you now, student, when talking or interacting with this AI chatbot, you need to really think about what is true, what is not true. But in the beginning, you don't know their identity. You don't know whether they are fake or not fake. So, I just
That's
find this,
very cool.
yeah,
Huh.
I just find this approach so interesting. And since you're talking about this prompting, and I just feel, okay, now, since what we have been recording this for over an hour, now what all the things I have talked about in the past, 75 minutes, starting to connect is, you know, how we can I think the DBR is now being exemplified, and then AI prompting techniques have exemplified now how teachers actually playing a role because teacher now has to observe how the students actually interact with the AI chatbot. And I was just like, this is like so cool. And I feel like for me, now wearing the hat of DBR, DBIR, and now I think about this whole chatbot design. it just making things so much. And again, I think you use the term attuned. It's a very, very powerful and effective word. Like, of course, we can embed chatbot in any of our classes. I remember I talked to you in our course, like how we can use synthetic student as a, promote like online collaborative learning. And so again, it's like it's still serving the student, still the who, but where, when, and how is something that involves a lot of intricacy. Then that's where I think not only teachers but also edtech entrepreneurs, we really, really need to think very seriously, very creatively about this.
And what I would add, so I agree with everything that you just said. And another important consideration with design-based research, in my view, is there's something not sexy about it. And here's what I mean by that, is that if you're going to go down this road of design-based research, and if you are going to agree that you need to be attuned to the circumstances, you really need to see what people are doing and how they're using your tools. So let's take this as an example. And this is what I'm going through right now with a course that I'm teaching, right? So I gave my students an assignment. They had to come up with their sort of a small evaluation framework for an ed tech tool. That was one part of the assignment. But the other part of the assignment that I built in is that they actually had to do this in collaboration with a generative AI bot, right? So this is an assignment in which I had actually invited them into collaborating with the AI to co-design a framework. So let's set that aside for a second, and talk about the real practical elements. Okay, so I had a goal, I had a learning goal, right, associated with the use of that AI, right? And this really has to do with, this goes way back to the beginning of our conversation about AI as collaborative partner, right, as augmenting intelligence. And so I want to know, well, what does that look like? How does that get operationalized? What does it look like when AI, in my view, is augmenting human intelligence? And I came up with a rubric, and this is maybe a topic for another discussion, but here's why I'm raising this. What's the evidence, right? So there's product. The product is whatever the evaluation framework is, but that's not so helpful because I want to know about the collaboration with the AI. Well, right now, at least given the tools that I have at my disposal, the way for me to do that is to get screenshots of their dialogues with the bot, right? So I asked them, here's what I asked them to do. I said, I want you to capture 3 or 4 what you consider to be meaningful moments of engagement with the bot, right? What was the original prompt? When did you make revisions? And then what were your 3 or 4 meaningful moments? And then they had to explain to me why they were meaningful with respect to producing this framework. But here's the thing. It's time consuming, not only for them, but for me, because now I have to look through these screenshots and I have to look through revisions, right? And so to come back to what I was saying, if you're going to be in the DBR space, if you're going to do this kind of attunement, we have to think about, like, what are the realities of the situations in which people exist, right? Because here I am in this situation. I'm super excited about generative AI chatbots. I want my students using them. And yet I have this whole other layer now of artifacts that I have to consider in order to make some judgments about their learning and their progress, right? Now, one way is you just wave that off and say, well, that's their problem. That's the educator's problem. But it's actually not, particularly if you're an entrepreneur, right? Because if they can't use it and do it quickly, they won't use it. They just won't, right? And particularly in K-12 settings, teachers are very, very busy people. But this is true in higher education as well, right? If this adds a whole other layer of time to your efforts that you had not anticipated, forget it, right? I mean, and we know about this, right? We know that the way that these kinds of innovations get adopted, they've got to fit in with your goals and they've got to fit in with what you're doing. But the point that I'm making is that this attunement really requires you to see what people are trying to do and how they are using your tools, where your tools are helping them do that, and where they might be getting in the way, and being committed to not just waving that part off. right? And saying, well, that's their problem. Because again, to come back to the mission, well, you can't be very mission driven if you're just saying, you're introducing a tool into a space and saying, well, that's generated a problem, but that's not my problem. That's their problem, right? That to me is not being very mission driven. So it's extremely important, I think, through this lens, to honor the work and the contexts in which your intended audience, learners, educators, users are working, because it's going to be better for them and it's going to be better for you in the long term.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is really, really inspiring and insightful. And I want to wrap up the podcast with one last question. Um, so you have years and decades of, research experiences, and now you are teaching edX entrepreneurs. I wonder if you don't mind, like, can you name a skill or mindset that is absolutely vital for designing, impactful solutions? And well, providing some context, what do you think is the most underrated skill or habit for edtech social entrepreneurs in the current age?
Oh, that's a hard question.
Or what is the most overrated one?
I mean, at the risk of repeating myself, it may be the thing that I just said, right? In terms of underrated, is that you have got to be able to listen and see what is happening in front of you with your world of users. That's one. And the second is, and maybe this is a way of talking about empathy, or maybe attunement is another way of getting at it, is that you have genuinely got to be invested in what it is that they're trying to achieve, right? In my view, you can come at it from, look, I think this is what should happen. I think this is what should happen. And there's always going to be some aspect of that. If that wasn't true, you probably wouldn't be doing what you were doing to begin with, right? You see a problem in the world, you have an idea for how you think that problem needs to be solved. That's your idea. You see it going a certain way. But if you're not able to actually integrate your view with what it is that people are actually trying to do, it's just not going to work, right? And so in terms of being understated, it is the ability to see what's happening in front of you in some given problem space and be realistic about it, but then also honoring the goals, the agency of your learners and educators, right? What are they trying to do? In a way, you are there to serve them through the design, development, and implementation of this solution, right? You are trying to support them. And yes, you're trying to achieve your own goals as well, but you all are also there to support them in serving their goals. And so I would say, I don't think these are skills that are always valued, although they ought to be. But I think seeing what's in front of you and then honoring your users, your participants, your population's agency are both incredibly important.
Thank you so much, Dr. Diamond. It is thrilled. It's so fantastic to talk with you today. I learned a ton. I feel like, yeah, I'm going back to campus again. Start learning again. It just never ends, like whenever you talk to an
Thank
expert.
God.
This is what learning is. Um, so thank you so much for your time and your sharing of your insights, and a lot of guidance, a lot of truly helpful and constructive takeaways that I believe every single of our listeners will learn a ton. I definitely look forward to having you coming back again to share more. And if you don't mind, I will put your kind of information or your work site as part of the show notes so people can follow you. I believe they will learn a ton, and then maybe someone will reach out to learn more from you.
Wonderful. Well, it's been a great conversation. As always, it's great to see you. It's like I said, anytime you and I talk, interesting things come out of it. So I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you so much.